The following recorded program is sponsored by Democrats for Nixon.
Good evening. I'm John Connelly. I'm a Democrat who, along with many of my fellow Democrats, has become convinced that it is in the best interest of this country to re-elect President Richard Nixon. Our support of the president does not involve in any way the campaigns of Democratic candidates who are running for state, local, and congressional offices across the nation. But when it comes to the presidency of the United States, when it comes to choosing the man who must lead us all through the next 4 challenging years, we cannot afford to settle for second best. We cannot afford to put party before country. Tonight, I want to discuss with you why millions of Democrats this year have determined that they should cast their votes for President Nixon and reject the candidacy of Senator McGovern. People vote one way or another in a presidential race for a variety of reasons. They may feel very strongly for a candidate, or they may feel very strongly against a candidate. They may like the type of leadership the country has, or they may not like it. They might even vote strictly because of party label. Many Americans and many Democrats are making their decision this year on the fundamental question of confidence. Which of the 2 major candidates, they're asking, should be entrusted with the duties and responsibilities of the most important elective office in the world? Which one has earned our confidence? Which one is the strongest leader? And above all, which of these men favors policies which will maintain the basic security of our country and safety of its people? The answer, I think, is clear. That's why so many Democrats this year agree with John Kennedy's comment that sometimes party loyalty asks too much. The next President of the United States may have it in his power to create a generation of peace, to build on the progress toward a peaceful world that President Nixon has made in Peking, in Moscow, and in capitals around the world. But to do this, the next president will have to be a man that other nations can trust and respect. And he will have to stand for policies and programs that will keep America strong and healthy, militarily, economically, and morally. These past 4 years have produced days of greatness in American foreign policy, days of which all Americans can be proud. There was the opening up of the communist world of Eastern Europe for the first time to an American president. A president who has journeyed behind the Iron Curtain to the capitals of Romania, Yugoslavia, and Poland to inaugurate a new era of aggressive American diplomacy. There was that memorable moment when a president of the United States, for the first time in history, set foot upon the mainland of China to sit down and negotiate with the leaders of the most populous nation on earth, a nation with which Americans had had no real communication in more than 20 years. There was that day in the spring of this year when an American president, again for the first time in history, journeyed to the capital of the Soviet Union for a summit conference that has advanced the hope that our children can live in a more peaceful world than the one we have known. There was that moment in Moscow when the agreement was signed to control the nuclear arms race, the first step toward a dream of centuries that great nations might someday lay aside their arms and join together in the works of peace. Just a few days ago, the President signed that historic piece of paper that put the SALT agreements into effect. These historic moments, these advances toward a more peaceful, more open world, must be credited to the leadership of President Richard Nixon, the youngest elder statesman of our era. But they're not simply the splendid achievements of Richard Nixon. They must be credited to others as well. They are the fruit of a third of a century of American leadership. They are the result of steadfastness, wisdom, and courage on the part of not one, but 6 American presidents, 4 Democrats and 2 Republicans. There was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who recognized that the United States could not survive isolated from the rest of the world, and that without our leadership, there was no hope of freedom for any man, anywhere. There was Harry S. Truman, who stood up to Joseph Stalin at the Berlin blockade in Turkey, Greece, and Western Europe. when there was no one else in the entire free world strong enough to face the threat to peace. There was Dwight D. Eisenhower, whose policies made America the unchallenged leader of the West and kept America the most powerful nation on earth. There was John F. Kennedy, who stood the test of Soviet ambitions in the Cuban Missile Crisis and proved again that a strong heart is the best safeguard against nuclear war. And there was Lyndon Johnson, who withstood the most bitter criticism, much of it from Senator McGovern himself and others within his own political party. He refused to abandon America's friends, whether in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East. So let's review that history in these brief observations on the differences between the two major presidential candidates this year. 5 American presidents, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, believed our country must have a strong defense if we were to have any hope of an enduring peace. President Nixon has kept us on that wise course. George McGovern has demonstrated that he will not. 5 American presidents gave people the world over the only beacon of hope for freedom and safety in the atomic age. President Nixon has kept that commitment, and George McGovern has demonstrated that he will not. 5 American presidents held fast to the belief that the United States should not become a second-class power. President Nixon has reconfirmed that basic principle of foreign policy, but George McGovern has demonstrated that he will not. 50 years ago, Woodrow Wilson knew what George McGovern has forgotten today. Woodrow Wilson said it best when he spoke these lines: "The isolation of the United States is at an end, not because we chose to go into the politics of the world, but because by the sheer genius of this people and the growth of our power, we have become a determining factor in the history of mankind." President Nixon knows that there's no security for America in a retreat from the world, and Senator McGovern does not. Let me give you a graphic example of this from a quarter century ago. In 1947, Democratic President Harry Truman called on Congress for economic and military assistance to help the government of Greece defend itself against Soviet-supported communist guerrillas and to prevent the nation of Turkey from falling prey to communist intimidation. That presidential decision, the Truman Doctrine, set the course of American foreign policy that exists to this day. In the House of Representatives, 287 Democrats and Republicans stood with President Truman to halt the advance of Stalinism into Central and Western Europe. This congressional record shows the men who joined hands on that crucial vote. John F. Kennedy, a 30-year-old freshman from Massachusetts, who went on to become President of the United States. Lyndon B. Johnson, a 38-year-old congressman from Texas, who went on to become President of the United States. And Richard Nixon, a 34-year-old freshman congressman from California, now President of the United States. That's what we mean when we speak of the great bipartisan tradition of American foreign policy. Now let's examine what George McGovern was saying in those critical years when a chaotic world was on the edge of freedom or the brink of tyranny, depending solely upon what the United States was able and willing to do. Here are George McGovern's words in a letter he wrote on the issue of aid to Greece a quarter century ago, at the time when Congressman Johnson, Kennedy, and Nixon were supporting the Truman Doctrine. I quote his words as he wrote them. U.S. military aid is flowing into Greece in an effort to prop up a decadent, reactionary monarchy, a feudal policy which we inherited from the British at a time when they had already realized its stupidity. If those words of George McGovern many years ago sound familiar to you, they should. While he's not known for consistency on many issues, Mr. McGovern has not changed his isolationist tune in 25 years. When American aid helps a country fight for its life against communism, George McGovern invariably says it's useless and stupid. George McGovern invariably claims it's wrong, even when history proves conclusively that it's right. And just as George McGovern was outside the mainstream of American foreign policy in the Democratic Party in those years, he is outside both of them today. In 1948, when millions of Democrats rallied to President Truman, Mr. McGovern rallied to the cause of Henry Wallace, the presidential candidate of a left-wing splinter party which believed America should ignore the communists and trust to their benevolence. While freedom was crumbling in Czechoslovakia, while Greece was being attacked, and while the Russians were moving to blockade West Berlin, George McGovern was denouncing those Americans who thought something should be done to stop it. This is what he wrote. Under the blinding light of the current Red Scare, we're going all out for nationalism, militarism, suspicion, and power politics. Do we realize that we only show our loss of faith in the American dream when we foolishly hope to stop communism with dollars and bombs? 25 years later, George McGovern chose as his presidential campaign slogan the entreaty to come home, America. Judging by his record of the past, it's small wonder that to millions of Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, that slogan smacks of something we rejected a long time ago, whether we like it or not. This country has responsibilities of leadership which cannot be cast away. The United States has not and cannot sound the trumpet of retreat. Mr. McGovern deserted the Democratic Party for Henry Wallace in 1948, and today he justifies that action by saying, and I quote him, "I liked what Wallace had to say about foreign policy. I still think he was essentially right." It's because of this kind of reasoning that Senator McGovern today offers America not consistency and continuity for her policies of national defense and international relations. He offers us instead a radical departure, grounded in some utopian view of the world totally divorced from reality. George McGovern would turn America away from what 6 presidents of the United States have helped to create. He would wrench American foreign policy out of the great traditions maintained by Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Richard Nixon. Before the American people take this drastic and dangerous step, let us consider what we're throwing away. Look at what a bipartisan American foreign policy has accomplished in 3 decades. We have defeated fascism and militarism on 2 sides of the world. We helped rebuild Western Europe from ashes to the point where today its nations are strong and free and vibrant. We held the line against communist aggression and expansion in Southern Europe and Korea and Vietnam. We have watched 60 new nations born out of the old colonial empires, and not one of them voluntarily chose the road to communism. We have seen Germany and Japan, once our bitter enemies, become strong and powerful friends. We have maintained a global environment in which foreign trade has grown to levels undreamed of, and nations and peoples have prospered as never before in history. We have helped to keep the global peace for more than a quarter of a century and prevented the nuclear holocaust that would have destroyed our world. We have maintained our vigilance and strength and watched the monolithic communist world split asunder. These are historic achievements, achievements that belong to 6 presidents and to neither political party. It is these historic achievements that I see today threatened by the policies recommended in advance by George McGovern. Senator McGovern may have captured the machinery and nomination of the great Democratic Party, but he does not stand in its traditions, and he has not captured its heart. And before any Democrat pulls the lever for George McGovern, let him think of what he's voting for and what he's voting against. The differences between the defense and foreign policies of President Nixon and Senator McGovern are as night and day. Since President Nixon took office, the cost of the war to the American taxpayers has been cut more than 2/3. the level of American troops has been reduced from almost 550,000 to less than 39,000. And most important of all, American war casualties have been cut almost 100%. But my fellow Americans, we're not coming out of Vietnam a defeated nation with our tails between our legs, as some would have us do. Our men are coming home to the United States, having done their duty and done it well. And they deserve gratitude and praise for the responsibilities they have met in the tradition of other young Americans who have done their duty to their country. What does Senator McGovern propose we do? He says we must shut off all military and economic aid to South Vietnam, despite the fact that the communist powers continue to fuel the war machine of the North Vietnamese invaders. Senator McGovern calls the president of South Vietnam, and I quote, a despicable creature. He compares the President of the United States to Adolf Hitler and Ho Chi Minh to George Washington. Senator McGovern claims the communists have, and I quote, been more careful in the way that they deal with the villagers than we have. He claims that when the communist troops take over a town, that, and I again quote, they don't assassinate people, they set up a school and a road system and a tax system, unquote. Like the Binh Dinh province, one supposes, or the city of Hue, where the bodies of thousands of murdered civilians were uncovered after American and South Vietnamese troops drove the communists from the city. We have a right to ask Senator McGovern, if the communists treat the villagers so well and Americans treat them so badly, why do all the refugees head for the South Vietnamese lines and none of them can be seen heading for the communist lines? On the question of prisoners, Mr. McGovern has said that after cutting off all aid to South Vietnam and pulling all troops and ships and bases out of Southeast Asia, he would take it on faith that Hanoi would let our men go. And if that didn't work, he would do a little begging to Hanoi. Begging is better than bombing, he says. Well, President Nixon has another way. When he is reelected, I can promise the American people this: the last American warplanes will not leave South Vietnam. The last American warship will not sail out of the Tonkin Gulf unless and until they have every single one of our American prisoners aboard. What about amnesty for draft dodgers? This issue tells you something about the two candidates, and the choice is also clear. Senator McGovern puts a high priority on amnesty for those who ran off to Canada and Sweden. When President Nixon is reelected, there will be no blanket, unconditional amnesty for draft dodgers and deserters. 2.5 million young Americans answered the call to arms to serve in this unpopular war. Thousands died for their decision. A small handful ran away to Canada and Sweden, and they're going to have to live with their decision. The real heroes of this generation are not those who fled, but those who served. They have risked their lives in the service of their country, and they have nothing to apologize for. There are also vast differences in the way the two candidates would deal with Europe and the Soviet Union. When President Nixon sits down at the negotiating table, you can be sure he conducts himself as the leader of the greatest and strongest democracy on earth. That method of dealing with the Soviets has produced agreements on trade, on scientific and medical exchanges, and most important of all, agreements to control the deployment of nuclear weapons. Senator McGovern looks at the Soviets another way. When a writer for Fortune magazine asked what he would do if the Soviets attempted to confront him the way they did John F. Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis, or President Nixon in the Middle East, Senator McGovern said, and I'm quoting, "I don't believe the Soviets would even try to test me because I think they would regard me as a friend and would do everything they could to keep my friendship, unquote. Now let me repeat that. And I'm quoting, I don't believe the Soviets would even try to test me, Senator McGovern says, because I think they would regard me as a friend and would do everything they could to keep my friendship, unquote. If George McGovern believes that, he is not living in the real world. The Soviets do not make foreign policy decisions on the basis of whether they like or dislike Western personalities. They make foreign policy decisions on the basis of communist ideology and Soviet national interest. Anyone who thinks otherwise does not belong in the Oval Office of the White House. With this naive view of the Kremlin, Senator McGovern has made proposals to cut an unprecedented $32 billion worth of men and weapons out of the United States defense budget. Senator McGovern likes to say he just wants to trim the fat. He claims he wants to stop the big, costly projects. He says he's against overkill. Well, every American leader worth his salt wants to hold the line on exorbitant spending in the defense budget and every other budget. Every American leader wants to eliminate waste and inefficiency. But Senator McGovern's proposals go far beyond that. Senator McGovern not only wants to trim the fat, he wants to cut out the muscle of our national defense. Let me show you precisely what he has recommended. If Senator McGovern has his way, the Marines would be cut by 1/3. The number of Navy warships would be cut in half. Our aircraft carrier fleet would be reduced from 16 down to 6. 50% of our American fighter planes would be cut out of the Air Force. The total United States Armed Forces level would be cut to a point lower than at the time of Pearl Harbor. Senator McGovern's massive cuts of our forces in Western Europe would be made without any reciprocal reductions in Soviet forces in Eastern Europe. He would shift the European balance of power decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. Senator McGovern says quite clearly that he wants to reduce the ships and manpower of the 7th Fleet in the Far Pacific and the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean. Not a small reduction, but cut these forces in half. He wants to reduce our naval air squadrons by a full 80%. An 80% cutback despite the dangerous turmoil in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. What would this mean in the Mediterranean, where the Soviet Union has been putting more and more sea power? Basically, it means that the Mediterranean would be on the verge of becoming a Soviet lake, and the fate and future of Israel would be decided not in Tel Aviv, but in Moscow. Senator McGovern would scrap 2/3 of the American bomber force. He would halt all improvements being made in the American missile force. He would move the United States from a position of strategic parity with the Soviet Union to a position of strategic inferiority. The United States would run the risk of becoming a second-class power in a world where it is dangerous for any democracy to be second class. The McGovern defense budget is the most dangerous document ever seriously put forth by a presidential candidate in this century. It would end United States military leadership in the world. It would make us inferior in conventional and strategic weapons to the Soviets. It would invite the kind of probing and aggression in Europe responsible for the last 2 wars. Senator Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic nominee in 1968 and a candidate in 1972, said that the McGovern defense budget would cut into the very muscle and fiber of American defense and jeopardize national security. Senator Henry Jackson, the most knowledgeable Democrat in the Senate on defense, has said that McGovern is running on a, and I quote, platform of national weakness, unquote. Dean Rusk, Secretary of State in the last 2 administrations, has termed the McGovern defense budget, and I quote him, insane. What Mr. McGovern does not seem to understand is that a strong military posture and a vigorous diplomacy for peace are not in conflict with one another. They are two fingers of the same hand. The stronger this nation is, the greater the guarantee that the peace will be kept, as it has been kept between the Soviet Union and the United States for a quarter century. The weaker America becomes in relationship to our potential enemies, the greater the chance of war by miscalculation. Any student of this century should know that it has not been the strength of free nations that has been the cause of war. It has been their weakness, their lack of will, their lack of purpose. 2,000 years ago, the Chinese built a wall to protect themselves against invaders. President Nixon stood on that wall earlier this year because it still exists as a great monument to man's creative genius. But the Mongol hordes which swept across the Gobi Desert were not deterred by the Great Wall of China any more than the Germans were deterred by the Maginot Line. And we can't build a wall high enough around this country to hide from our responsibilities as a great nation. We live in a dangerous and troubled world, and our leaders must have the courage to face that danger and help resolve those bitter troubles. President Richard Nixon is the preeminent foreign policy leader of our time. When a Southeast Asia treaty is finally hammered out, as it will be, I believe he is better qualified to represent the interest of this country than Senator McGovern. When the next round of the disarmament negotiations begins, we might ask ourselves, which man, Richard Nixon or George McGovern, is the better man to sit across that table from Leonid Brezhnev? All of this is what's really at stake on November the 7th for the people of the United States. Senator McGovern has a right to believe whatever he wants to believe. I do not question his sincerity or even his good intentions, but sincerity and good intentions are not enough. In 1956, Adlai Stevenson, who was running for president as a Democrat, said in a speech, "If the voters ever stop looking at the record and character of the candidates and look only at a party label, it will be a sad day for democracy." Well, November the 7th is not going to be a sad day for democracy. It's going to be a great day for America, because on that day the people of this country will reject George McGovern's call for retreat and reaffirm America's leadership in the world by re-electing Richard Nixon President of the United States. Thank you very much.
The preceding recorded program was sponsored by Democrats for Nixon.